Thanks for watching Day 3 of Sea Air Space 2020 Virtual Edition, brought to you by Leidos. Today, our focus is the Navy. I'm Francis Rose with the Government Matters Thought Leadership Network. Every year, the Navy League hosts the largest maritime exposition in the United States in National Harbor, Maryland. The goal is to bring U.S. defense industry and military decision makers together for 3 days of educational sessions, policy discussions, and a dynamic exhibit hall floor. Coronavirus forced the cancellation of Sea Air Space this year, so we've partnered with them to bring you some of that great information. We have a lot to cover today, including the priority list for Admiral James Foggo, commander of Allied Joint Forces Command Naples, U.S. Naval Forces Europe, and U.S. Naval Forces Africa. Plus, the tools Navy research, acquisition, and development teams have at their disposals to speed up buying in response to COVID-19. You'll hear from Assistant Secretary James Hondo Gertz. They're important topics and great speakers, so let's get started. Joining me first, Admiral James Foggo III via Skype from Naples, Italy. Admiral, thank you very much for joining me. I appreciate it. Thank you very much also, sir, for sharing the bulk of your remarks that you were going to deliver in your keynote at Sea Air Space, and thanks for joining me for this virtual edition. I thought we would talk through the themes that you wanted to present in that keynote, and I want to start, of course, with COVID-19 because that's the reason we're doing this virtually, and that's top of mind to everyone. You were going to tell the group at Sea Air Space that we're focused on the 5 traditional domains, land, sea, airspace, and cyber, but also a 6th and 7th domain. Tell me what you mean by that, Admiral.
Yeah, Francis, well, first of all, let me thank you for doing this along with WJLA in a virtual fashion and in light of COVID-19, because we could not do our traditional Sea, Air, and Space gathering. This is a terrific substitute or surrogate for people to get together and talk about those themes that are key. And of course, coronavirus has been something that's on all of our minds. It hit us earlier than it did the United States here in Italy, where we have several places and bases of the joint force that we operate. The Aviano Air Force Base up north. Gaeta, the small port town north of Naples, where our command ship is located, USS Mount Whitney, my favorite ship in the United States Navy. And of course, the headquarters here in Naples and the Sigonella Naval Air Station, which is almost like having an aircraft carrier fixed in Sicily, in the country or part of Italy that contains Sicily. And so, you know, when I did exercise Trident Juncture in the fall of 2018 and 2019, I found that the Achilles heel of that exercise, which was 50,000 personnel, 70 ships, including large ships, the Harry S. Truman Carrier Strike Group, the Iwo Jima Expeditionary Strike Group, 8,500 Marines, 18,000 Americans of the 50,000, 10,000 tractor rolling vehicles, and about 165 different type model series of aircraft, from cargo to fighters. Logistics was that Achilles heel. And at the time, I said that logistics was the 6th domain of warfare, in addition to land, air, sea, space, and cyber. Well, I am opining now about a 7th domain. And that 7th domain is just simply germs. It's the biosphere that we operate in. And I think we're going to have to take that into account in our preparations for deterrence and defense in the future. If you go back to 2015, Bill Gates did a TED Talk, which was pretty impressive. I didn't see it until a couple of months ago. And it was on, you know, what happens during a pandemic, and particularly referencing, you know, a form or function of the coronavirus. And there are things that we probably ought to do in the future to better prepare. This one kind of snuck up on us. You know, Gates, I have to give him credit. He said, you know, in addition to doing war games and tabletop exercises, we ought to do some germ X's. And I think he's right, but I think we have to incorporate that into our normal planning process and our normal exercise process that the J codes, the J7s of the world actually prepare and help us execute. There was an interesting one in April of 2020, at least this report came out from the Naval War College on Urban Outbreak 2019. And so it's a start in preparation for the future and incorporation into our planning processes. It used to be enough that you did a physical exam on the troops and a dental exam. I remember that was a precursor to anybody getting on a submarine for deployment. I'm a submarine officer. I've been a commanding officer, a group commander, and anybody that goes to sea for a long period of time, especially on our SSBNs, has to have the right dental and physical health. And we did vaccinations. So you had to get your yellow fever, you had to take, if you're going to someplace in the tropical climates, you had to take your malaria meds. Well, that won't be sufficient in the future. We're going to have to plan ahead on how to protect the force against something like the coronavirus until we get a vaccine against COVID-19. And then beyond that, there will be a next coronavirus. And I think we'll be much better prepared for that in the future. Right now, the kinds of things that we're doing is making sure that we identify anybody that's symptomatic, that we test those individuals. And testing is key, and you've heard that from all of the news services in the United States and all of the healthcare experts and Vice President Pence's task force saying that testing is key, because you can identify those individuals that are negative, and therefore the people that they've come in contact with are not necessarily, they haven't been exposed to the coronavirus. Those who are positive will have a certain diaspora of people that they've come in contact with, and those individuals must be put on restricted movement so that we can help them and assess whether or not they've actually contracted the virus. Now, testing works in our favor. We had a young person that was out in one of our naval bases who was symptomatic. He happened to be a crew member on a ship. He was tested. He tested negative. So we were able to take him from that ship and isolate him ashore to help him get the treatment he needed for what was just a general flu, and not have to worry about the 20 or 25 people that he came in contact with on that ship. And that ship was able to get to sea, and it has been coronavirus free since it got underway and prior to getting underway. So those are the kinds of measures that we'll have to take to protect our force, so our force can continue to protect you. Because, we can't afford to take anybody off the line in a day of great power competition where we have adversaries, we have competitors, and most importantly, we have violent extremists that want to take advantages of any chink in the armor and attack us at an untoward moment. So we're on watch, we're vigilant, and we're doing it out here.
Admiral, I want to talk about great power competition separate from coronavirus, if that's possible at this point in history. But you wrote in your remarks that you are being reactive and proactive in your response to coronavirus. Tell me how that looks inside the Navy, and you touched on that briefly a moment ago, but also what that looks like outside the Navy in cooperation with partners in Europe and partners around the world, sir.
Yeah, absolutely, Francis. And you know that there's a lot going on both with the United States Navy in fighting the coronavirus, both in the United States of America and overseas. So when I say that, we're being reactive, or more appropriately, we're being responsive, is we have these two wonderful ships, Comfort and Mercy. And I can remember from my time on the Navy staff as the N35B, the Deputy for Plans and Policy and Strategy. It took a long time to do what we call a PTDO, prepare to deploy order, for those ships. You have to put the medical personnel on those ships. Those ships are usually ready by the pier. They have a crew on board. You have to make sure that you have all the supplies on those ships, and then you get underway. And Comfort had just done a recent deployment to South America. One of the officers, Bill Shafley, who used to be my XO here, is a line officer. He's a Desron commander. He went along to help them, to help shepherd them through that deployment. And so that ship was pretty ready to go. She got underway in less than 2 weeks, along with Mercy out on the West Coast. So Mercy's in LA, Comfort is in New York City. That big, beautiful white ship steaming into New York Harbor with the Red Cross on it, I think, was reassurance to the people of New York and to the American people. And now we're looking at how we can better use the asset. And there's a lot of discussion about the patients that are coming on board the ship and the sharing of the very large hospital that the United States and New York City has established at the Javits Center. So that's some of our response. What we're doing out here is we're working through NATO with the Emergency Action Response and Disaster Center up in Brussels to assist our NATO partners and allies with anything that they can do. The Czech Republic recently helped Italy with some supplies. The United States and one of our NGOs, Samaritan's Purse, which is run by the Graham Foundation in North Carolina, is actually here on the ground in Cremona, Italy, with a 60-bed field hospital, and about 8 or 10 of those beds are ICU units. That same group is up in New York City in Central Park. The other things that we're doing here is some of the supplies that we have in excess have been transported by the United States Air Force in Italy and by the United States Army for the use of the Italian forces as they fight the coronavirus. And probably the most help that we can give our Italian counterparts here in Italy is to abide by their laws and decrees on physical, and I mean physical isolation, not social isolation. We're still keeping in contact with everybody. That's so important at this time when people feel alone. But the physical separation and the physical isolation is starting to drive the virus down. We've had a horrific death toll in Italy, reaching a high in a 24-hour period of about 969 Italian people died. And that number went down to something around the 625 range yesterday. So the incidences of spread of the virus and the death toll seem to be plateauing. And I hope that's indicative of the knee in the curve and driving down back to some new normal where we can get control of this thing, both in Europe and in the United States. And then we can figure out the vaccine, and then we can get back to lives in the new normal period, which will have to take into account any future pandemics.
Admiral, you wrote in your remarks for delivery at Sea Airspace, I think China has a responsibility to the global community to help, given their responsibility for the pandemic. What's China's responsibility here in your view, sir, and what's the recourse that the rest of the world basically has vis-a-vis China?
Well, you know, the G7 countries are talking about, a $4 trillion bill associated with coronavirus. But that may be a low figure. I mean, look at the $2 trillion plan that the U.S. government came up just for the continental United States and America. And certainly all nations have a responsibility to abide by the policies and the rules and the standards and the norms of the World Health Organization. And so when there is a problem or the outbreak of a virus like coronavirus, H1N1, influenza, or Ebola, probably the most important thing that you can do in accordance with the World Health Organization standards is to share data. And I think that China could have done better at sharing data. And I am a military officer, so I have my domain, and I don't want to point any fingers, but I think in the final analysis, we're going to find that collaboration and cooperation with not just the WHO, but with one another is going to be the key to fighting future pandemics. Now, China has come back with a lot of medical aid and assistance in the forms of personal protective equipment and some doctors and some nurses to those countries in need. And that is commendable, but it has to start with accurate reporting when there's an outbreak, which really didn't happen, and then sharing of data, which is currently a matter of debate right now. And I'll leave that up to the medical experts to sort through.
Admiral, before we move to great power competition more broadly, you referenced Ebola, and I wonder what the Navy's takeaway was as an enterprise and what your takeaway was personally from the experience that you had with Ebola in Liberia.
Yeah, so I've been in Europe off and on for 10 years. So I've watched Ebola spread in the African continent. And it got pretty bad the second time I was here, around the time I was the Sixth Fleet commander. And the real hero of that Ebola crisis was not a naval officer, but an Army officer, Lieutenant General Darrell Williams. And Darrell was the commander of U.S. Forces Africa, and General Rodriguez was the AFRICOM commander. Darrell was down just doing a kind of a familiarization tour in Africa, and General Rodriguez told him to stay after President Obama had pledged the aid of the United States of America to combat Ebola. So Darrell did what any military officer would do and what we're all trained to do. He took a very deliberate approach to this. And the first thing you have to do is separate the sick from the healthy, and you have to build places for them to go, hot zones and cold zones. And he did that. And there was some initial criticism on the part of healthcare organizations that we were either moving too slowly or taking too many precautions or using too much PPE. That turned out not to be the case, and it actually helped contain and not eradicate, but reduce the incidences of Ebola, which is an absolutely terrible disease and debilitating and lethal. The thing that the Navy was able to do, Francis, is, again, I go back to testing with the coronavirus. There was a story of a young woman who presented at one of these clinics with symptoms of Ebola. She had a fever. People said, well, we don't know, we have to test. So they took a blood test and they sent it off to a capital. It went via some slow method of transportation. And by the time that test came back from the hospital in the capital, the young lady had died. The test was negative, but she died because she contracted the virus, the Ebola virus, being exposed to other people that were in the same vicinity of this hot zone, cold zone hospital. So we were able, through Navy medical means, the Navy was able to dispatch some corpsmen, Navy corpsmen, with a field test kit. And a young man or a young woman operating together out in the field could take a test and make a determination on the spot. You either have it or you don't. And if you don't, you go home and you shelter in place. And so I think we're seeing the same kind of formulary here that's necessary to fight the pandemic. We've got to have the test kits, we've got to have the swabs, we have to have the reagent, and a lot of people are coming up with innovative ways to do this through either the machine, which is called BioFire, which we've received several of here so we can do local testing, or through serology, which looks at the blood and determines how many antibodies are in your system. So if you have an explosion of antibodies, obviously you've probably had the virus and you've probably survived. And furthermore, you may be safe to go back to work. And in our case, back to the base or back to the ship to fight the ship, and that's good.
Given that China, Admiral Foggo, is one of the named competitors in great power competition and ground zero of this, what's the nature of great power competition in light of this, and what potentially is the nature of great power competition 6 months from now, a year from now? And I'm thinking particularly strategically and operationally, sir.
Right. Well, I think China has a strategy, and it's a long-term strategy, Francis. And our two big competitors, according to the national defense strategy in the world, are China and China first, according to our Secretary of Defense, and I would agree with him, of course, on that, as well as Russia. And you can't forget other malign influencers in the world, like the Iranians, and we've seen a spike in negative activity in the Arabian Gulf recently, and we've put power projection and naval presence there to prevent any further violence. And then there's the violent extremist organizations, and some countries like Iran sponsor those violent extremist organizations. So we have to be on guard, and we've got a lot of challenges. China has a very impressive strategy of One Belt, One Road expansion around the world. They have established bases and places in theaters that I never thought I would see them. So they are in Djibouti. They have a base which went up very quickly, not far from Camp Lemonnier, which is our base and our center of operations in the Horn of Africa, and it gives us access to the Red Sea and to the Gulf of Aden, and of course on and into the Persian Gulf. Well, Chinese realized that, and they put a base of their own there. The difference between China and the United States in their strategy is that the Chinese will come in, they will bring their own indigenous labor, and they do not necessarily invest as we do. For example, about 8.5% of our investment in the country of Djibouti for Camp Lemonnier and the laborers that work there and the infrastructure projects, that's about 8.5% of their GDP, which is, it's nice that Americans are able to pump something back into the economy. For the Chinese, not so much. My example that I always use is Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka got themselves in debt up to about $8 billion with Chinese infrastructure projects. The Chinese came back and they said, look, we'll forgive some of that debt, about $3 billion. All you have to do is give us control of the port of Hambantota. And that is a very important deep water port, and they got it for a period of 99 years. And of course, when you have control of a port, you can control access. And so that is concerning to me as the Chinese increase their footprint throughout the world. Now, I would hope that China would learn how to rise peacefully. And I would hope that in light of the aftermath of the coronavirus and the impact that it's had on all nations of the world, that we would work better together. But as my former boss and currently the ambassador to South Korea, Admiral Harry Harris, used to be the PACOM commander, would always tell me when I worked for him here, hope is not a plan. So you must be able to deter and defend. And that's where the United States Navy comes into the picture. You know, we are operating as usual, business as usual here in this theater. Just last weekend, Vice Admiral Lisa Franchetti and the Sixth Fleet had 3 of our 4 destroyers from Rota, Spain, out at sea and operating, and 2 of our P-8 aircraft. And we were able to show that visually on our websites and in our social media to let everybody else know that might challenge us. We're open for business. I also have the pleasure of having the USS Harry S. Truman Carrier Strike Group in my theater right now. And the 2 guys running the show on that strike group and that ship are Rear Admiral Bucket Loisel and Captain Hack Hakamzada. I knew those 2 guys. Hack used to work for me when I was 6th Fleet. He ran the USS Mount Whitney. He was the skipper. Bucket's the strike group commander. You know, I called them up before they got here, before they came through the Suez Canal, and said, hey, how are you guys doing? What do you need to keep your crew healthy? And they are healthy, and they are operating, and they are out here. And that sends a huge deterrent message to anybody that might want to take advantage of us in what they appear or what they may think is a time when we're distracted with coronavirus. But that's just not the case here in the theater of Europe and Africa. And I'm pretty pleased to say that the United States Navy has a lot to do with our defensive posture and our readiness right now.
Admiral, I could go for hours and hours, and I imagine you probably could too, but unfortunately we're starting to run out of time, so I just have one final question for you. You told the story about the Sri Lankans, and I think the One Belt, One Road initiative is very well known in the circles in which this conversation will circulate. You said, talked about the payback for the loans and taking over the port. You wrote in your remarks that you were going to deliver to Sea Airspace that we are the friend of choice for these countries around the world. At what point do you see that these countries will decline to choose to participate in One Belt, One Road, that the ends don't justify the means, and that they will continue or accelerate their choice of us as the partner of choice? And what's the Navy's role as an instrument of that, Admiral?
Well, Francis, I think we have to continue to be present. And through our presence, we not only demonstrate sea power, but through our acts of friendship and partnership, we gain access to places in the European theater, which is in my backyard, and also in the big, beautiful continent of Africa. And that is so important. You know, I ran probably the largest amount of naval presence down in Africa in 2018 and 2019. We had USS Mount Whitney down there for Obangami Express. I'm going on 10 years of experience here with the Africa Partnership Station. We brought over the Coast Guard cutter Thetis, which did a real-world, counter fisheries, counter piracy operation against nefarious actors in the Gulf of Guinea, and that was thanks to the Commandant of the Coast Guard, Commandant Schultz. And we took the USNS Carson City and we ran her down to 5 countries in West Africa, and we rowed ships and we fixed ships. And as I told my African CNO counterparts, we're out here with our ships, riding your ships, fixing your ships, but the only ship that we ask for in return from you is friendship. And I hit that theme every opportunity I have a chance to. And I think they believe that the United States Navy and the United States of America are the partner of choice.
Admiral James Foggo III, thank you very much for joining me from Naples, Italy. I appreciate it very much, sir.
Francis, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you and the rest of the great participants of Sea, Air, and Space. And thanks to WJLA for enabling this virtual encounter this year in light of the coronavirus.
Up next, Navy Research, Acquisition, and Development's concerted effort to speed up buying, deploy real-time systems, and track disruptions COVID-19 causes. You're watching Sea, Air, Space 2020 Virtual Edition on the Government Matters Thought Leadership Network. Stay with us.